How do we know it's the guns? Well, there's a great piece in the New York Times back in November of last year. I recommend you look it up, where they sort of break some of this data down. And the research that they are referring to in the Times piece is from a guy named Adam Langford. He is a professor at the University of Alabama, did a study back in 2015. Here are the things he found. He found, first of all, of course, we have 270 million guns in this country, almost as many guns as there are people. The United States only has 4.5% of the population of people on this planet, but we own 42% of the world's guns. The only nation that has a higher rate of mass shootings is Yemen, and Yemen has the world's second highest rate of gun ownership after the United States. So even to the extent there is one that slightly outpaces us on a per capita basis, let it be noted that Yemen has the second highest rate of gun ownership. So the top two, Yemen and the United States, in terms of mass shootings, are also the top two in terms of gun ownership. Might there be a connection there? You know, the law of parsimony, basic statistical common sense tells you yes. When you look worldwide, as Professor Langford did, he found that a country's rate of gun ownership correlated with the odds that it would experience a mass shooting. He also looked at mental health, and he found that the mental health care spending rate in the United States, the number of mental health professionals per capita in the United States, and the rate of severe diagnosed mental disorders in the United States are all in line with those in other wealthy nations. No real statistically significant difference, and yet we have a bigger problem, so it can't be mental health. And in fact, a study in 2015 found that only about 4% of American gun deaths overall could be attributed to mental health issues. So that can be in play, and obviously I think we'd probably agree that nobody who commits a mass murder type shooting is probably psychologically healthy. The question, however, is whether or not a mental illness, a diagnosable mental illness, was the catalyst for the crime. We can argue that anyone who does this is emotionally and psychologically disturbed or disordered, and yet they may not be legally or clinically mentally ill. Oh, and by the way, it's also worth noting that even if every single one of the shootings was done by someone who was mentally ill, that doesn't really change the fact that mentally ill people who don't have access to weapons of mass murder have a harder time committing mass murder. The New York Times piece also pointed to a study back in 1999 by Franklin Zimring and Gordon Hawkins of the University of California, which found that when you look at the United States, we don't actually have a lot more crime than other developed countries. Contrary to popular belief, we sometimes think that we have the most crime. We don't necessarily have the most crime, but what we do have is that our crime is more lethal. So what Zimring and Hawkins found is that someone in New York, for instance, even at that time, and crime in New York has fallen even more in the last 20 years since they did their study, but someone in New York was just as likely to be robbed as someone in London. There really wasn't any difference if you're in London or New York, but the New Yorker was 54 times more likely to be killed in the process of the robbery, which again speaks to the hardware being used in the robbery. It's a lot harder to kill someone you're robbing if you don't have a gun than if you do have a gun. And so when you rob someone in the United States and you put a gun in their face because you can, because there are all these guns around, you're more likely to use it. And so there is a direct relationship between the number of guns and the level of gun ownership and violence. More gun ownership simply corresponds with more gun murders in developed countries, in American states, in towns and cities, and even when you control for the crime rates. And gun control legislation does in fact reduce gun murders. According to one recent study, looked at 130 studies in 10 countries, and it all found the same thing. Gun control legislation does reduce gun murders. And yes, of course, I do know the comeback. I've been hearing it since I was a kid. You've heard it as well. The folks who say, oh, gun control legislation won't really work because, you know, the people who are motivated to commit crimes with guns, they're just always going to be able to find a gun. And so passing laws against these guns or trying to ban these guns, you know, that just won't work. But if that's your argument, that bad guys are always going to find a way around the law, then that's a reason not to have any laws at all. Why have any laws? Because by definition, lawbreakers are always going to break laws. So I guess we shouldn't have laws against robbing banks or laws against rape or laws against assault or laws against murder because, you know, if you're really dedicated to doing that, you'll just go out and do it. That's not logical, right? We have laws, A, to express the moral and ethical sense of the community, B, to deter certain crimes, and C, to allow for punishment. If you're going to argue that laws don't deter bad guys, then why would you have, for instance, a law against child pornography? Right? I would say that pedophiles, I'm guessing, are probably pretty highly motivated to find child porn, right? And they are probably every bit as motivated to find and view child porn as a school shooter, potential school shooter, is to go shoot up a school. So by the logic that says, well, why ban guns of this sort or that sort? Because, people can always get their hands on them. By that argument, we shouldn't ban child porn. But of course, we should ban child porn. A, because child porn is toxic and evil. And B, because by banning it, you know what? You actually do deter people from looking at it. I would guess, and I think it's probably a fairly good guess, that there are lots of sick people out there who would look at child porn, who would participate in the viewing, if not distribution of child pornography, but for the fear, thank God that they have, that if they do, they might go to jail because they probably figure, you know what, somebody's monitoring that. So in fact, having a law that bans child pornography does keep people who would otherwise look at it from doing so. Is it going to stop everybody? No, we still have prosecutions for child porn, thank God. People get arrested for that all throughout the course of a year. You'll hear, some big stories about that in the news. So it doesn't stop it entirely, but only a fool would deny that it reduces it. When you pass a law against something, it does in fact diminish its occurrence.